The Sleeping Stones. I'm Beatrice. I'm a stage manager in theatre, and I am also a medieval historian, and I also have been writing stories for children for many, many years, but this is the first time that one has been published. So that's all very exciting. The Sleeping Stones is a fantasy adventure set on an island off the coast of Wales, where ancient legends are stirring. And Griff and his friend Matt live there. Griff has lived there his whole life, and for generations his family have lived on the island, but his family's farm is in money trouble and they might have to leave soon. Into this comes Matilda, who has only just moved onto the island, but she seems to have a strong affinity with the sea. In very little time, Griff and Matt find themselves working together to save their community from a devastating storm driven by an ancient magic anger. So it's the landscape in this story is infused with myth and is a character within the book itself. So I'm going to do a short reading from chapter 5. And Griff is on his way round to his neighbour Yola with some dinner in a bowl for him, because they quite often they take it in turns to cook for Yola, because otherwise he'd just live on baked beans. He's on his way around to meet him. He's also just had a very strange walkie-talkie conversation with Yola, in which Yola suggests that the Sleeping Stones, which are 6 stones that lead out from the island's beach like giant stepping stones, heading for the horizon, but they're not reaching anywhere, they're just reaching the sea. Yola suggests that they might be waking up. Night was well fallen now. Griff stopped and looked out to the deep, dark colours of the sandy beach and the increasingly choppy water around the jagged sleepers. Though they had seemed to pull him earlier, he felt nothing from them now. The wind lifted his short hair and sucked greedily at the warmth of the bowl in his hands. He should get on to Yola. Nine hadn't seemed concerned that Yola was spouting nonsense about the sleepers, but she hadn't heard the catch in his voice. Besides, his tea was going cold. And then it was as though someone had thrown a lasso around his heart and pulled hard out to sea. Griff took an unexpected giant jerking step forward off the path and tripped on one of the rocks on the sea bank at the head of the beach. He fell forwards, hugging the bowl and plate to his chest. He tumbled down the stone sea bank, all elbows and knees, and thumped onto the firm sand of the beach. He lay still, breathing shallowly and trying to work out what had happened. He had stepped forward, caused his own fall. Why on earth had he done that? He was curled round the bowl and plate as though they contained a precious treasure rather than a portion of his Nine's bog standard cottage pie. His cheek pressed uncomfortably against the gritty sand, but he didn't feel quite ready to move yet. He looked out to the sleepers. The waves lapped and sucked, and in the wind the swell leapt a little higher, slapping and chopping. With that rhythm came an urge to move, to stir himself and stand, to run to the sleepers, to start the journey out to sea. Griff got to his feet. He saw a 7th stone. On it stood a tall figure, dark and indistinct. The moon was hidden behind the gathering clouds. The figure had their back to him and wore a cloak that flapped and cracked in the wind. Shock swept the lure of the sleepers clean out of him. Griff stood on trembling legs, the bowl raised like a weapon. He stared and blinked, and the figure and stone were gone. Someone shouted behind him. A high, thin voice swept away on the wind. He turned and saw a small figure running along the path of the farm, stumbling on stones they could not see in the dark. Bouncing plats gave Matt's identity away. "Are you okay?" she shouted as she got closer. "I came out to explore. I saw you fall." "I'm okay," Griff said. He felt unsteady like he did when Dad woke him from a deep and vivid dream. But which was the dream and which real life? Matt seemed like an imagined sprite as she ran towards him, whilst the figure on the stone that was not there, they had been the most real thing he had ever known. So what's interesting about this story is that I began it sort of 3 times, at least 3 times, but then these are the main ones. And I guess what inspired it is landscape and myths. But that inspiration didn't sort of just appear one day and then I had the story and I was ready to go. It began with a short piece of writing I did for a workshop at Bath Spa, which was actually about selkies. And I had some seals coming out of the sea and turning into people. But the place I had this happening was where I had these stones that were leading out from the beach towards nothing, and I had this idea that they were luring people out to jump along them. So those were the sleeping stones. And when I came to write it up into a full story, the selkies just disappeared completely, and the sleeping stones were what remained. So it was the landscape that I took from it. And then similarly, I wrote it up on the MA as my sort of final project. And then I left it for a couple of years, and I was doing my thesis in archaeology, and I was reading about folklore, maritime folklore in early medieval Wales. And I came across the character Llanidloes, who I have come across before, but I read about him again. And I went, oh, it's his story. He lives in that world that I'd sort of begun to poke. So I thought I'd finished this whole story, and I hadn't. And I began all over again from chapter 1, wrote almost entirely different story, but with very similar bones. So the landscape stayed, the sleeping stone stayed, the island, and the feel of that place was there. And I sort of developed that over time. And then the myth that fitted in properly came along, and then it all sort of clicked. So I think fantasy books and fantasy in general, it helps us to understand ourselves and the world around us, whether that's other people or the natural world, or events that are either like in our control or out of our control. And it helps us explore complex issues or heavy topics in a safe space. And it just kind of means that it allows us to step outside our immediate experienced reality and gain a greater understanding of sort of shared human experience, I think, in fantastic when you're able to tell fantasy stories that can cover great themes in a more perhaps accessible or at least sort of like, I don't know, I feel like they can cover quite universal themes that can touch many people. I think it's my fantasies. So the pesky sheep, have all come from pure experience. However, human characters, I actually find them really hard to write. It's been something that I know that I needed to get better at, and I needed to recognise that I have a tendency to start with landscape and then have some plot, and then I get really excited about those things, and then I think, oh, I should have somebody in this to make the plot happen, and then I sort of chuck some people in, and my sister spotted this early on, and I thought, no, how can you possibly say this character's too deep? And then I went away and I thought about it. I was like, yes, because it's correct. But it was something that I've sort of learned across the years to notice, to allow my characters to speak for themselves, I suppose, to really think about what that individual character wants, what they need, where they came from, what their memories are, and which ones of those memories are the most important, and how they became who they are at the beginning of the story, and what happens to them throughout the story is much more real, I suppose. It's more honest if you know who the person is at the beginning. But that is something that I actively work at, thinking about who my characters are and where they've come from, because it's not. Some people say that they have characters who appear fully formed, and they don't for me. But it means that it's all the more, for me, I find it all the more satisfying when I eventually find that Griff and Matilda are in my head now, and I know what they do if a certain situation happened now, because I know how they would behave, because I know them as people. But it takes a lot of thinking and working out and trial and error before I got there. So I didn't know that I was specifically going to write about home. Not really so much about the concept of home and whether it's and home being where the people you love are, home being the place that you feel at home, and I I didn't know that the story was going to be about that. But then once I began writing this final version, I just found that it was. I'm not surprised that it became a really important theme, because it's an important thing to me. I have a deeply held belief that home does not have to be where you were born, and that blood has absolutely nothing to do with belonging. And home is about choosing your family, choosing the place that you wish to be, and wish to create your community in. So those are things that I sort of feel quite strongly in myself, and have always believed those things. So but I didn't know that they were going to come out in this story the way they have, but I'm glad they have. So, everything I've read, that's true. So everything I've kind of gone, oh, what about that? I don't like that. But in specific terms of the fact that I have a tendency to lean towards stories that are taking place in a contemporary, real world, but mythology and legend is leaching into that world. And there's a sort of and I always love those kind of stories, and I know that they've had a big impact on me, the ones that I particularly love. So Susan Cooper's The Dark and Rising sequence is one of those. Alan Garner's The Owl Service is another fantastic example of that, which actually is based on the same Mabinogion story that Llanidloes Dawn appears in. But Llanidloes Dawn's just like a paragraph, and everyone forgets that. And what people remember is the day where the woman made of flowers. I have a complete mind blank, and I don't know what I was talking about. Thank you. It happens sometimes. It's fine like that. The other thing I want to say is Catherine Fisher. She's really cool. She's great, and I love her writing anyway. But there's 3 books in particular that were published in an anthology, and I had it from when I was about 10, and I read it and reread it and reread it. And when I first went to university, I thought, oh, this is it. Academia has stamped my creativity out of me, and I thought I'm never going to be able to write again. And I came back from my first year at university convinced that I would never be able to write a story again. And then I reread this book, and it unlocked that part of me. And it's called The Glass Tower, and the three shorter stories in it are The Conjurer's Game, The Candleman, and Fintan's Tower. And I just love them so much. And so those kind of contemporary world stories, but with the ancient legends seeping in, definitely. I hope that they'll enjoy it. I hope that I think there's definitely an element of I like the idea that once a book goes off to its readership, it's up to the reader to decide what they take from it. But I suppose the things that I'd like people to perhaps take are a love for natural places and wild spaces, and a desire to cherish them and look after them, and treat them with respect, I suppose, and feel that they are for them as well, and that it's not sort of I don't know, that it's nothing to do with them, and also that kindness and empathy are heroism as well. Thank you very much for coming.